She thought I was just another outsider, some guy who didn't belong on her perfect little street. But when she called the cops to kick me out, she had no idea I was the one signing her HOA checks. This is how karma knocked right on her pristine porch. The morning air was calm, that kind of suburban stillness that hides all its chaos behind trimmed hedges and freshly painted fences. The street looked like a postcard, neat lawns, SUVs glistening under the sun, and houses aligned like they'd been measured by a ruler. But beneath that perfect surface, something darker pulsed, an arrogance built on years of control, gossip, and fake smiles. That's where she ruled, Karen Whitmore, self-proclaimed queen of the block, unofficial head of the HOA even though she'd never been formally elected. Her power didn't come from a title, it came from fear. Everyone knew better than to cross her. She'd written warnings for mailbox colors, called code enforcement over lawn heights, and had single-handedly driven one family to sell their home after they refused to change their porch light. To her, the HOA was her little kingdom, and everyone else was a subject expected to obey. But that morning, a new moving truck rolled in, backed up right in front of the one house she thought she controlled the most, the one she didn't know had just been sold. The sound of the reversing beeps echoed down the quiet cul-de-sac, breaking the delicate peace she protected so obsessively. Curtains twitched. Neighbors peeked out, whispering. And Karen, standing on her porch with her coffee, felt the heat of intrusion. The man stepping out of that truck wasn't what she expected. He was built like someone used to discipline, calm posture, clean cut, steady eyes. Not the type who flinches when confronted. He didn't wave. He didn't explain. He just got to work unloading boxes, like the street belonged to him. That's what infuriated her most. By noon, she was already calling the HOA office. "We weren't informed of any approved move-ins," she complained, her tone dripping with authority. The office told her the paperwork had been finalized quietly, the house was under new ownership, but the records hadn't yet been circulated. To Karen, that was unacceptable. Someone had dared move in without her approval. That was a declaration of war. So, she did what she always did, started her patrol. Clipboard in hand, sunglasses on, pretending to be checking compliance violations, but really just circling like a hawk. She noted every detail, the truck slightly touching the curb, a moving box sitting on the grass, the fact that the man's car didn't have the HOA-issued parking tag. To her, every small thing was a crime. Meanwhile, the man, Ethan Cross, stayed quiet. He'd seen her type before. He'd spent years in the military dealing with people who mistook authority for respect. Karen was no different, just louder. He knew the best way to deal with people like her was patience. Because sometimes, the best revenge is letting them dig their own hole. By late afternoon, she approached him, but this chapter isn't about their words, it's about the storm she unknowingly triggered. Because in that moment, she wasn't talking to just another homeowner. She was talking to the man who had just bought the entire cul-de-sac, including her house's mortgage rights through a real estate acquisition deal she didn't even know existed. For Ethan, this wasn't about power, it was about reclaiming peace. The neighborhood had been a nightmare for the last landlord, who'd begged him to buy it. Ethan saw it as an opportunity, a good investment, a quiet community to rebuild his life after years overseas. He didn't expect to start a war on day one. But Karen made sure that peace wouldn't last. The next morning, flyers appeared on every mailbox. They warned residents about unauthorized occupancy and potential safety concerns. She'd written them herself, printing them under the HOA logo she wasn't even allowed to use. Her goal was simple: isolate the newcomer before he could become part of their world. It worked, at least temporarily. Neighbors started avoiding eye contact, whispering when he walked by. Kids who waved the first day were now pulled inside when he passed. The air changed. That's how control works in suburban wars, not with guns, but with gossip. What Karen didn't realize was that every move she made was being documented. Every false notice, every harassment claim, every violation she issued without approval, Ethan kept it all. Because when you've spent years in intelligence, you don't react emotionally, you collect evidence. By the third day, she took it a step further. She called the cops. She reported a suspicious man unloading items without authorization. Claimed he was trespassing on HOA property. And when the patrol car rolled into the street, she stood there like she'd just saved the neighborhood. Neighbors peeked out again, this was her stage, and she was the star. But the officers didn't find a trespasser. They found property deeds. Real ownership papers. And Ethan's name wasn't just on that house, it was on multiple lots across the block. What they didn't know yet was that through a holding company, Ethan had become the new landlord of half the HOA's rental properties. Karen had just called the cops on her boss. The tension that followed was quiet, but heavy. The kind that doesn't explode, it festers. Karen, humiliated in front of the neighborhood, refused to back down. She doubled down instead. More letters. More warnings. More subtle acts of defiance. Because people like her don't admit defeat, they turn it into vengeance. That evening, as the sun went down over the calm, painted homes, Ethan stood in his driveway watching her lights flicker across the street. He knew this was just the beginning. HOA power wasn't built overnight, and neither would its downfall be. But this time, the tables had turned, and she didn't even know it yet. Because the next HOA meeting would change everything. And Karen was about to find out who really owned the street she ruled. The HOA's monthly meeting had always been Karen's moment of triumph, a stage where she could perform her power. Folding chairs lined up neatly in the community hall, coffee cups stacked in the corner, and a clipboard at every seat. It wasn't about running a neighborhood, it was about maintaining her illusion of control. But that evening felt different. The air carried tension, not comfort. People whispered in small groups, their eyes darting toward the empty seat at the end of the table, the one reserved for the new owner. Karen's lips tightened every time someone mentioned his name. She had told herself the police incident was a misunderstanding, that she'd been right to call them. But deep down, humiliation burned like acid. Ethan Cross hadn't said a single word to her since that day. No complaints. No confrontation. Just silence. And that silence was far more dangerous than any argument. Because silence meant patience. It meant calculation. As the meeting began, Karen took her place at the front. Her papers were perfectly arranged, every agenda item pre-highlighted. She cleared her throat, projecting confidence. The same voice that once commanded fear echoed across the room, but this time, it didn't land the same. The first few topics were routine, fence repairs, parking disputes, and lawn maintenance. Her rhythm returned briefly, until the door opened. Every head turned. Ethan walked in quietly, wearing a black jacket, holding a slim folder. No entourage, no arrogance. Just calm, steady presence. He sat at the far end without saying a word. But that single action, taking a seat instead of the audience's bench, changed the dynamic instantly. Karen's smile stiffened. "Oh," she said lightly, "you're here to observe? HOA meetings are open to residents." He didn't respond, but he didn't need to. He placed his folder on the table, the word ownership records, printed neatly on its cover. Whispers rippled through the room. Karen's throat tightened. She tried to continue reading from her notes, but her voice cracked just slightly. She masked it with another sip of coffee and pushed forward, but inside, her composure fractured. Ethan waited until the meeting reached financial matters. That's when he stood. He didn't need to speak loudly, his presence carried weight. He simply handed the folder across the table. Inside were documents proving his ownership of multiple properties within the HOA, including the lot on which the community hall itself stood. His holding company had acquired them legally, signed and filed through the county recorder's office. The shock was instant. Gasps filled the room. Some residents looked at Karen for answers, others at Ethan for confirmation. Karen's cheeks flushed crimson. She stammered something about procedural review, but the truth was in black and white before her. For years, she'd ruled through intimidation, but the one thing she could never control was ownership. And ownership was now in Ethan's hands. He didn't make a speech. He didn't gloat. He just left the folder on the table and quietly said, in his calm, steady tone, that any future HOA actions needed his authorization. The board could continue functioning, but all property-related decisions now required the landlord's approval. That statement changed everything. Karen sat frozen. Her authority had just evaporated in front of everyone. The whispers turned into murmurs, the murmurs into cautious questions. For the first time in years, residents began addressing someone else, not her. They turned to Ethan. They asked him about upcoming maintenance, budgets, and improvements. He answered with measured professionalism, outlining a plan to lower unnecessary fees, clean up outdated rules, and make the community more transparent. The same ideas that Karen had rejected for years suddenly sounded like freedom. Her empire crumbled quietly. When the meeting ended, people approached Ethan one by one, shaking his hand, thanking him, offering baked goods, anything to show alliance. Karen watched from the corner, her clipboard now feeling like a shield that no longer worked. That night, she sat alone in her spotless kitchen. The silence in her house was deafening. Her phone buzzed, messages from board members asking if Ethan was now in charge, if she should step down. Each notification chipped away at her self-image. She poured herself another glass of wine and stared out the window. His moving truck was gone now, replaced by a clean black SUV parked neatly on the curb. She hated that car, not because of what it was, but because it represented someone who had taken what she believed was hers. But people like Karen don't surrender. They re-strategize. She spent the next few days digging. Calling the county clerk's office, searching online databases, anything to find loopholes. She needed leverage, something to challenge his ownership. She convinced herself this wasn't over. And that's when she found it, or thought she did. A small discrepancy in one of the property documents, a technicality involving a sublease. It wasn't major, but to her, it was enough. Enough to start a rumor. Soon whispers spread again, this time about Ethan's questionable ownership, about potential fraud. She didn't say it outright, but she didn't have to. In a small neighborhood, suggestion is enough to rot truth from the inside. Ethan noticed the shift almost immediately. People grew polite but distant again. A few board members started hesitating before replying to his emails. The gossip machine was working exactly as Karen wanted. But what she didn't realize was that this time, she wasn't playing against ordinary neighbors. Ethan had seen manipulation before, in politics, in power, in people. He knew exactly how to handle it. He began quietly preparing for the next move, one that wouldn't just silence Karen's lies, but expose the kind of person she'd been all along. And when it happened, it wouldn't be at a meeting. It would be on her own doorstep. Because the war for control of that street wasn't over, it was only beginning. And in neighborhoods like these, wars aren't fought with weapons. They're fought with truth and paperwork. The neighborhood seemed calm again, but calm is only an illusion before a storm. On the surface, everything looked normal, kids on bikes, sprinklers running, and the faint hum of lawnmowers in the distance. Yet beneath that perfect suburban rhythm, distrust had begun to spread like oil on water. Karen could feel it. The same neighbors who once greeted her with respect now gave her awkward smiles, half-hearted waves, or avoided eye contact altogether. They didn't say it aloud, but she knew they were slipping away from her control. And she blamed one man for it. Ethan Cross. The man who had moved in quietly, dismantled her authority without raising his voice, and turned her own kingdom into his property. Every time she saw him walking his dog in the morning, calm and unbothered, her blood boiled. He never looked angry, never retaliated, never even acknowledged her efforts to provoke him. That calmness was worse than confrontation. It made her feel invisible. But Karen wasn't ready to disappear. She had spent over a decade crafting this image, the woman who knew everything that happened on her street. The enforcer of rules, the keeper of order. Losing that meant losing herself. So she decided to strike again, not with words this time, but with paperwork. It started with a simple idea: if Ethan wanted to play the landlord, she would make his ownership miserable. She began filing HOA compliance checks against his tenants, claiming improper landscaping, parking violations, and unapproved fixtures. She flooded the office with requests for audits and legal reviews. She wanted to drown him in bureaucracy. But Ethan had already anticipated it. A week later, a letter arrived in every resident's mailbox, stamped with the seal of Cross Property Holdings. The letter announced a comprehensive financial audit of the HOA's past 5 years. It was written in professional, detached language, but everyone knew what it meant: Ethan was investigating Karen. She didn't see it coming. At first, she laughed it off, told her friends it was a scare tactic, that he was bluffing. But the next day, auditors arrived at the community office with boxes, scanners, and clipboards. Every record, every receipt, every miscellaneous expense she had approved over the years was pulled from storage. Karen's confidence began to crack. For years, she'd managed HOA funds casually, approving landscaping contracts for her cousin's business, reimbursing herself for community improvements that no one could quite remember, even purchasing small decor upgrades for her own home under community expenses. It wasn't criminal, at least, she told herself it wasn't, just management perks. But in the hands of an investigator, those gray areas turned pitch black. Word spread fast. Neighbors started asking questions she couldn't answer. Why had maintenance fees doubled last year? Why were funds allocated for playground repairs never used? Why did the HOA spend thousands on consulting that no one could trace? Each question hit like a hammer, and with every hit, her composure slipped further. Ethan never confronted her directly. He didn't need to. His quiet efficiency did all the damage. He met with residents one by one, explaining how transparency could improve the community, how they could lower dues, how their money could finally go where it was supposed to. He wasn't just removing Karen's control, he was replacing it with trust. And trust is far more powerful than fear. Within 2 weeks, Karen found herself isolated. The board she had once controlled began ignoring her messages. The HOA treasurer resigned, citing ethical concerns. Even her closest allies started distancing themselves, terrified of being implicated. Her perfect reputation, the one she had built over years of intimidation and manipulation, was unraveling thread by thread. But Karen wasn't done, not yet. Late one night, she sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by old files and receipts, trying to find something, anything, that could turn the tide. She was desperate, flipping through stacks of paper, muttering to herself, her once immaculate home now cluttered with chaos. Then she found it, an old maintenance contract bearing Ethan's company name. It was dated before he moved in, back when the previous landlord still owned the properties. On paper, it looked like he'd done business with the HOA even before buying the street. To Karen, that looked like a conflict of interest, something she could twist into a scandal. The next morning, she printed copies of the contract and slipped them into mailboxes. She added notes in red ink. "This is who you're trusting, the man profiting off our fees." The rumor spread instantly. Social media posts, whispered conversations, suspicious glances. For a moment, she felt powerful again. The queen had found her footing. But Ethan was 2 steps ahead. The contract she had found wasn't a secret, it was a matter of public record. In fact, that same contract was part of the audit. And when the auditors released their preliminary findings, it became clear Ethan's company had been hired years ago to fix the HOA's infrastructure after Karen's poor management. He hadn't hidden it, she had. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. Karen's move backfired spectacularly. Not only did the community see through her manipulation, but the audit also revealed her misuse of funds, thousands of dollars unaccounted for, checks written to herself, and expenses labeled miscellaneous that pointed directly to her. The news shattered her. One by one, her allies abandoned her. The HOA board voted to suspend her position pending investigation. The same neighbors who once feared her now demanded accountability. She tried to hold another emergency meeting, but only 3 people showed up, one of them just to record it for proof. The woman who had once ruled every inch of that street now stood in a half-empty hall, staring at faces that no longer cared. Ethan didn't attend. He didn't need to. His absence said more than his presence ever could. That night, Karen stood at her window, watching the streetlights flicker over the homes she used to command. Her power was gone, replaced by quiet laughter drifting from across the lawns, the laughter of people finally free from her shadow. But inside her chest, anger still smoldered. She wasn't ready to surrender completely. And as the auditors prepared their final report, she decided she'd do something reckless, something that would make sure Ethan regretted ever setting foot on her street. Because in Karen's mind, she wasn't defeated. She was just waiting for the right moment to strike back. And that moment was coming faster than anyone expected. The audit had left the neighborhood in stunned silence. What once was a community ruled by fear had turned into something unrecognizable, lighter, freer, yet uneasy. The illusion of order Karen had built for years had collapsed in front of everyone, and now, her name carried a different weight. People didn't whisper it with respect anymore, they said it like a warning. But Karen wasn't done. In her mind, she was still the victim, the misunderstood leader betrayed by the very people she had protected. She convinced herself that Ethan had manipulated everyone, that he had staged the audit to humiliate her, and that he was trying to destroy the HOA entirely for his own profit. Anger turned into obsession. Every night, she sat in her dimly lit living room, staring at her window blind slightly open, watching Ethan's house across the street. His calm presence infuriated her more than any insult could have. He still walked his dog at the same time every morning, still waved politely to neighbors, still smiled like nothing had happened. To her, that smile was mockery. So she decided to wipe it off his face. Her plan began small, petty, even. Anonymous complaints to the county inspector about construction noise and possible zoning violations. Calls to code enforcement, claims of hazardous materials being stored in his garage. She even started taking photos of his tenants' cars and sending them to the HOA office with false timestamps. Most of it went nowhere, but it gave her something she hadn't felt in weeks: control. But Ethan noticed. He didn't respond publicly, he didn't file counter-complaints or confront her. Instead, he began documenting. Every strange inspection, every anonymous letter, every fake violation report, he logged them meticulously. His quiet patience wasn't weakness, it was strategy. Still, Karen mistook his silence for vulnerability. She believed she was getting to him. Then one night, she crossed a line she couldn't uncross. It was past midnight. The street was quiet, only the sound of distant crickets and the soft buzz of street lamps. Karen walked slowly toward Ethan's driveway, clutching her phone. Her plan was simple: take photos that made it look like he was running unauthorized rentals, maybe even construction work. She'd send them anonymously to the local zoning board. But as she crept closer, something unexpected happened. A sensor light flicked on, bright, blinding. For a split second, her heart stopped. And then she saw the camera. Mounted on the corner of the house, motion activated, blinking red. She froze, realizing too late that every step she'd taken had been recorded. Her hand trembled as she lowered the phone, backing away slowly, heart pounding. She hurried home, praying he hadn't seen it. But Ethan had. The next morning, a short clip appeared in the HOA's internal group email, a security camera still showing a shadowy figure near his garage, clearly recognizable as Karen. No accusations. No captions. Just the image, time-stamped and sent without commentary. The neighborhood erupted. Messages poured in, some defending her, most shocked. The woman who had spent years accusing others of breaking rules had been caught trespassing on private property. She tried to deny it, but the footage didn't lie. Her last bit of credibility vanished overnight. That humiliation should have ended it. But for Karen, it only fueled her rage. She became reckless. Desperate. She started driving around the block at odd hours, taking notes on who visited Ethan's house, who spoke to him, who didn't. Neighbors reported her peering into windows, sitting in her car with the headlights off, watching. The community started fearing her, not respecting her. Meanwhile, Ethan began quietly restoring order. He met with the new interim board, introducing fairer rules and reducing HOA fees. The neighborhood started thriving again, lawns greener, kids playing freely, laughter returning where tension once lived. And that peace, ironically, became Karen's breaking point. She couldn't stand seeing everyone happy without her control. So she did something that would seal her fate. Late one evening, she drafted a letter, not an email, but a printed, official-looking notice, using the old HOA letterhead. She forged signatures, stamped it, and distributed copies door to door. The notice announced an emergency fine to every household, claiming new fees for security and maintenance. It looked real enough to fool most people. By morning, panic spread. Residents called the office, confused and angry. The HOA board denied any such notice, and all eyes turned toward one person, the only one with access to that letterhead. Karen. Within hours, Ethan had the forged letter analyzed and traced to her home printer. The evidence was undeniable. And this time, it wasn't just humiliation. It was fraud. The board voted unanimously to remove her permanently. A formal notice was filed, and local authorities began reviewing the audit findings, including the fake fines and the trespassing incident. When the officer came to deliver the notice, Karen didn't open the door. She just stood behind her curtain, pale and trembling, watching her empire collapse completely. The officer taped the paper to her door and left. The street was silent. For the first time in years, she wasn't the one giving orders. She was the one being watched. Inside her spotless home, the silence was suffocating. The walls that once echoed with her power now felt like a cage. She could hear neighbors outside laughing, kids playing, sprinklers hissing, all the sounds she used to control, now reminding her of everything she'd lost. But in her mind, it still wasn't over. She told herself she'd find another way, another angle, another weakness in Ethan. She started digging again, calling old contacts, trying to gather dirt. But what she didn't realize was that while she was plotting, Ethan was finalizing something much bigger. Because he knew this wasn't just about property anymore. It was about peace, and he was done letting her destroy it. The next step wouldn't just end her control. It would erase her legacy completely. And when it came, it would happen in public, in a way no one on that street would ever forget. The calm after chaos can be deceptive. On the surface, the neighborhood seemed to return to normal, lawns trimmed, mailboxes freshly painted, and HOA meetings filled with polite small talk instead of shouting. But beneath that veneer of peace, something massive was building. Ethan knew it. And so did Karen. Her downfall hadn't been quiet, it had echoed across every doorstep. The woman who once enforced the rules was now the example of what happens when power corrodes trust. But despite her public humiliation, she refused to vanish. She stopped attending meetings, yet her shadow lingered. Her car still appeared on the street corners at odd hours. Neighbors caught glimpses of her behind curtains, phone in hand, still watching, still plotting. Her obsession had twisted into paranoia. Meanwhile, Ethan had been working silently, not out of revenge, but to restore the integrity that Karen had destroyed. The audit had revealed enough to justify her permanent removal, but he didn't want to just remove her. He wanted to make sure she could never weaponize control again, not here, not anywhere. That's when he discovered something even deeper. While reviewing HOA archives, Ethan and the board's new treasurer found discrepancies that went far beyond small reimbursements. Buried beneath years of misfiled documents were duplicate expense sheets, ones that didn't match bank statements. Payments made to consultants who didn't exist. Checks written under false names. It wasn't just mismanagement anymore. It was fraud. And Karen's signature was on every one of them. Ethan didn't rush to expose her. He built the case carefully, line by line, document by document, working with auditors and legal counsel. He knew if this went public, it needed to be bulletproof. The plan took shape over several weeks. The next HOA meeting would be open to the entire community, the largest attendance in years. Flyers went out announcing a community transparency session, a meeting to reveal the new financial direction of the HOA. Everyone showed up. The hall was packed, homeowners, tenants, even local reporters curious about the audit fallout. The tension was electric. People whispered as they filled the seats, speculating whether Karen would dare show her face again. And then, just before the meeting started, she did. Karen walked in, chin raised, wearing a forced smile that didn't reach her eyes. Her once polished appearance was fading, her hair slightly disheveled, her posture defensive. She wasn't invited, but she came anyway, driven by pride or denial, maybe both. Ethan didn't acknowledge her. He simply began the meeting with his calm, even tone. He talked about the importance of accountability, of rebuilding trust, of creating a neighborhood that worked together instead of against itself. His voice carried a steady confidence, and people listened, not out of fear, but respect. Then he opened the binder. One by one, he presented evidence, bank records, duplicate transactions, unauthorized payments, all bearing Karen's signature. Each page he turned landed like a hammer. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, their faces shifting from shock to anger to betrayal. Karen's hands trembled. She tried to interject, mumbling about misunderstandings, clerical errors, miscommunications, but the numbers didn't lie. The room that once obeyed her was now watching her unravel. Ethan didn't raise his voice. He didn't humiliate her. He simply showed the truth, calmly, professionally, and publicly. When he finished, he paused and said, "Transparency doesn't destroy communities. Secrets do." The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Karen's composure finally broke. Her lips quivered, eyes darting around the room for support that wasn't there. The very neighbors she'd controlled for years now looked at her with quiet disgust. The people she'd bullied into submission had become witnesses to her downfall. She stood abruptly, papers scattering from her hands, and stormed out of the hall. The door slammed behind her, echoing like a final curtain closing on the empire she had built. For a moment, no one spoke. Then, slowly, the applause started, hesitant at first, then growing louder, filling the hall. It wasn't applause for humiliation. It was for closure. For freedom. Karen didn't stop driving until she was miles away from the neighborhood. Her phone buzzed endlessly, messages, notifications, calls she didn't answer. She parked on a quiet roadside, staring at the steering wheel, her breath shallow. For the first time, she felt what she had made others feel, powerless. Meanwhile, back on the street she used to rule, life finally began to breathe again. The community rallied under Ethan's leadership. He introduced open voting, online transparency for HOA expenses, and neighborhood events that actually brought people together. The fences that once divided neighbors now became places for casual conversations. The street felt human again. But even with peace restored, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that Karen wasn't done. He knew people like her rarely disappeared quietly. There's always one last move, one last spark of vengeance before they fade completely. And he was right. 3 days after the public meeting, an envelope appeared on his doorstep, no return address, just his name written in bold letters. Inside was a single sheet of paper, a cease and desist letter, threatening legal action for defamation of character. At the bottom, in neat handwriting, was her signature. Ethan smiled, not with amusement, but with calm understanding. He'd expected it. He forwarded it to his attorney, filed it away, and went on with his day. He knew the fight was already over. Because truth doesn't need to shout to win, it just needs to be seen. That night, the street glowed with porch lights and laughter. Families grilled outside, kids ran across lawns, and neighbors shared food like they hadn't in years. The community had finally reclaimed its identity. But across town, in a small apartment far from her once perfect street, Karen sat alone. Her phone buzzed again, another notice, this time from the state investigator's office. Her clerical errors had officially become criminal charges. The woman who once ruled through fear now faced the consequences of her own deceit. Still, in her mind, she whispered the same line over and over. They stole my street. But the truth was, it had never really been hers. Time has a way of rewriting stories, polishing the edges of chaos until they become memories. Months passed since the night Karen's empire collapsed, and the street she once ruled had changed completely. The lawns were greener now, but not because of HOA rules, because people cared again. The sound of laughter had replaced the sound of complaints. The community that had been fractured by fear was slowly healing, brick by brick, conversation by conversation. Ethan watched it all from the same porch where it had begun. The morning sun cut across the driveways, glinting off freshly washed cars. Neighbors waved when they saw him, some stopping by with coffee, others with small updates about garden projects or neighborhood plans. For the first time, this place didn't feel like property. It felt like home. But there was still one shadow left to confront. Karen's name hadn't disappeared entirely. Her case had made local news, former HOA president accused of embezzlement and fraud. Reporters had shown up to her trial, cameras flashing as she kept her face turned down, the once proud enforcer now stripped of control. She pled guilty to lesser charges, escaping prison but not the humiliation that followed. The fines were steep, her reputation destroyed. The same people she had once intimidated now crossed the street to avoid her. For most people, that would have been enough. But not for Ethan. He wasn't after vengeance, he was after closure. He needed to see it through, not out of anger, but out of respect for the people who'd been hurt along the way. So one quiet afternoon, he drove across town to a small, aging apartment complex, the address listed in her case records. The building looked nothing like the manicured homes of the HOA neighborhood. Faded paint, cracked pavement, the faint hum of a vending machine by the entrance. He knocked on her door once. Silence. Then, the faint shuffle of footsteps inside. The door opened just enough for her eyes to appear. There was no trace of the powerful Karen anymore. No polished hair, no clipboard, no confident glare. Just exhaustion, and the hollow look of someone who'd lost everything except their pride. Ethan didn't speak. Neither did she. He simply held out an envelope, not legal papers, not threats. Inside was a short letter, typed neatly and signed with his name. In it, he explained that the HOA had decided not to pursue further damages. The case was settled, the fines were paid, and her ban from the community remained permanent. But he also wrote one last line. Sometimes power destroys what it was meant to protect. I hope one day you find peace away from it. When she finished reading, she didn't say thank you. She simply nodded, a silent surrender. Ethan turned and walked away, leaving her in the dim hallway. Behind the door, Karen stood still for a long time, staring at the letter. For years, she had defined herself by control, by rules, by authority, by fear. And now, stripped of it all, she realized she had no idea who she was without it. That was the real punishment. Back in the neighborhood, life bloomed again in ways no one expected. A new community garden was built where the old HOA notice board once stood. Kids painted colorful murals on the side walls. Every month, instead of meetings filled with shouting, there were gatherings filled with laughter, barbecue, and music. Ethan rarely spoke about what had happened. He didn't need to. The street itself told the story, every smiling neighbor, every open door, every act of kindness that replaced a complaint. He'd become more than a landlord. He'd become part of something living, something good. And though the world had moved on from Karen's reign, her story remained a quiet legend on the street, a reminder that sometimes justice doesn't roar. Sometimes, it whispers. Late one evening, as the sun melted behind the rooftops, Ethan stood by his mailbox, the same one Karen had once threatened to fine him for. He looked down the street, the sky glowing gold, the hum of life surrounding him. That's when an older neighbor approached, one of the few who had lived there even before Karen's rule. She smiled, handed him a folded newspaper clipping, and said softly, "Thought you'd want to keep this." It was an article from the local paper. Former HOA president sentenced to community service for fraudulent practices. Below it was a photo of Karen, picking up litter on a roadside, wearing an orange vest, head bowed. Ethan stared at it for a long time, then folded it back up and slipped it into his pocket. He didn't feel joy, or pride, or even triumph. Just peace. Because in the end, the street didn't belong to anyone. Not Karen. Not him. Not the HOA. It belonged to the people who lived there, the ones who finally remembered what community really meant. As night settled, porch lights flickered on one by one, filling the street with warm yellow glow. The laughter of children echoed faintly in the distance. Somewhere, a radio played an old song about second chances. Ethan leaned against his fence, smiled, and whispered under his breath. This is how it was always supposed to be. And for the first time since the day he arrived, he felt the weight lift completely. The story of the landlord and the HOA Karen had come full circle. Control had met compassion. Deception had met truth. And the street had finally found its peace.